There's a pretty popular phrase that you guys probably know. Just for a second, when we were singing Jesus Messiah, I had a total throwback to 90s Christian music. Did anybody else see those 90s Christian music videos running through your brain? Okay, on to. I knew if I didn't say that, then it was up in my brain. There's a popular phrase that you probably, I'm guessing many of you guys have used it. I know I've used it. The phrase, I'll believe it when I see it. Guilty, right? We've probably used this at one point in time in our life. We may have even used it recently. I'll believe it when I see it. Usually we think of this phrase in negative connotations. It usually comes with a sidebar as to why we don't believe that something is going to happen, and that if it did happen, it would be a good surprise. And maybe we don't say it. Maybe it's one of those phrases that we don't say out loud, but maybe it's one of those phrases that we think a lot when we deal with others or situations or any of that. And so I was thinking, as I was thinking about this phrase, and I was thinking about all that comes along with this, so Adam and I usually are on very opposite ends of the spectrum on things. There are things that he's like, I'll believe it when I see it. And I'll be like, no, I really think it's going to happen. And then there'll be things that I say, I'll believe it when I see it. And he's pretty much just he's already in. He believes that it's going to happen. Now, if we come across things that we both go, I'll believe it when I see it, those are usually the things that just aren't going to happen. Probably, but I would to say we're probably about 50-50 on things. But if it was one side or the other, I don't know, and we might argue differently on this. I would say that I'm a little more of a negative on things. Like I said, it kind of depends on what it is. I'd say I'm a little more negative about things, and he's a little more like, let's do it. Let's, just simply because sometimes he gets distracted with shiny things that promise, right? And so then he's like, oh, I'm getting a look. He knows I'm hitting a nerve this morning. And then I sometimes have to be like, I just don't think it's the greatest idea. Anyway, I believe I'm more the one at home in our marriage that says, I'll believe it when I see it, or I tend to ask more questions about things and go, well, this doesn't quite fit in the way that they say that it's going to. I don't trust this. I don't trust that this is going to happen the ways that they say it's going to happen. I don't trust that this is, and I'll believe it when I see it kind of thing. I sometimes see things as bad things when they're not necessarily bad things. They weren't intended to be a bad thing, but I just kind of get leery of them. Usually things that promise big things, I kind of get leery of. And, when we think about these things, when we think about the times that maybe we've used that phrase in the past, the I'll believe it when I see it, a lot of times when we use a phrase much like that, and there are other phrases like that as well, it's because we've kind of gotten burnt in the past, right? It's because sometimes when we've put our faith into something, it hasn't necessarily rang true. We've kind of got burnt from it. And we tend to stay away from things that have burnt us in the past, right? And maybe you're like that, or maybe you have such a positive outlook on life that you walk straight into something without asking questions and without having doubts. I had a lot of things that I felt in my lifetime that has, quote, burnt me in the past, right? And church was one of those things that I felt had burnt me in the past, and it was very difficult for me to come back into a gathering of people, right, that were Christians, and to trust and to have faith. Adam was one of those ones, he just jumped off the deep end, right? I was one of those ones that I was like, I'm going to question everything. I'm going to have lots of doubts in this. And I'll say that it didn't mean that God loved me less and Adam more because he jumped off that cliff quickly, and I came to that cliff of Christianity like through a lot of questions and doubts and all of that. There's not, God loves us all the same, right? And so I wouldn't say that there was a difference necessarily, just in the difference in how we approached it. And I would argue that we shouldn't love people less just because they question or because they have doubts. This past week, as we were here for the care closet, I was back in my office trying to work on some assignments, and so I listened to this sermon. I'm in preaching too, and so I had to listen to a couple sermons from couple different pastors as an assignment. And so I was listening to this sermon from N.T. Wright, who's a bishop. He was giving the sermon, and he mentioned Thomas, and he just kind of has a little bit of a sidebar on Thomas, and he just continued to come to mind. And so I just started researching Thomas and like thinking about Thomas as a character within the biblical text, and I started thinking about him and his story and all of this, and I was like, okay, God, this is where you're taking us this week. This is where you want us to go. And so I just jumped into learning almost everything that I could about Thomas, and it really started speaking to me and fitting in with the rest of the things that were going on around me in this past week. Now, we in Christian circles probably call Thomas by the name Doubting Thomas, or at least you've heard that, right? And when you Google Doubting Thomas, you see blogs and articles on tips how to not be a doubting Thomas, or what makes you a doubting Thomas, or what to say to a doubting Thomas. And we kind of take this all as a negative thing. But I would tend to argue that we've given Thomas a little bit of a bad rap in the past. Because Thomas, much like us, or like those around us, Thomas is much like us, or much like those around us, but we're kind of afraid of the stigma that goes along with the whole doubting Thomas thing, that maybe we don't see it, or maybe we don't necessarily call it the same way. Now, Thomas, as a Hebrew name, or Didymus in the Greek, meant twin. So we can assume just from that Thomas is a twin, but we're unsure really if he legitimately is a twin, or if who that twin is, or any of that. Thomas, if you read through the Gospels, Thomas says some kind of dramatic things that makes you think that maybe Thomas is one of those like all in or all out kind of people. Thomas has a little flair for the dramatic, and the scripture we're going to read today about Thomas isn't lacking on the Thomas dramatic flair. So just remember that coming into our scripture, that Thomas is a little dramatic. But anyway, we're going to read in John chapter 20. Now, this is past Jesus' resurrection, right? This is past when Jesus was crucified and laid in the tomb, and he rose again, and he had shown himself to Mary Magdalene. He had shown himself to the disciples. And then we get on down into this chapter. We are reading starting in verse 24 of chapter 20 of John. Now Thomas, also known as Didymus, one of the 12, was not with the disciples when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hand and put my finger where the nails were, and I put my hand in his side, I will not believe." A week later, his disciples were in a house again, and Thomas was with them. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." And he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here. See my hands. Reach out your hand and put it on my side. Stop doubting and believe." Thomas said to him, "My Lord and my God." Then Jesus told them, "Because you have seen, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." So Thomas had not been with the disciples when Jesus came to them right first after the resurrection. And Thomas, not one to be taken in by something, who heard this, what some people would think was a crazy story. Thomas didn't just say, "I'll believe it when I see it," right? He kind of went above and beyond that phrase. Thomas said, "I'll believe it when I see it, and I'll believe it when I touch it," right? When I touch the wounds of Jesus, then I will believe it. And maybe I'm wrong in this. Maybe I'm reading more into Thomas's actions and what he says and thinking of the whole of the Gospels. But what I see when Thomas says that phrase is someone who's been taken in before, someone who's been lied to before, someone who isn't holding their breath for this to happen. And maybe that's a place where we maybe all have been, where someone tells us this, whatever it is, and we go, "Yeah, I don't believe it." And the next part of this is really kind of where my heart was in this passage as I thought about this, how Jesus reacts to this. Jesus comes into the room, and the biblical text makes sure for us to understand that the door was locked, right? So Jesus comes into the room, whether he walks through the wall or however, Jesus comes into the room, and he knows what Thomas has said, right? We understand that through reading the text. And he doesn't just go up to Thomas and say, "Well, you didn't believe without seeing, so I don't want you to just get out of here. Your doubts and your questions are not welcome here." And Jesus didn't initially go in and say, "Well, you don't have faith, so we don't want you," right? Like, he doesn't say that at all. And Jesus doesn't push him to the side. Jesus doesn't show up and tell them that saw him previously, talk to them and then tell Thomas to leave. Jesus shows up in that room and finds Thomas and says, "Put your finger here. See my hands. Reach out your hand and put it on my side." Jesus shows up and says, "I know you have doubts, so here, I'm showing you. I'm showing you. Thomas, stop doubting and believe." And we in the past have read this almost as a rebuke, and I can see how we have read it that way, but I don't believe that it's a rebuke in the ways that we believe that it's a rebuke. I don't think it's totally that way, because if it was a complete and total rebuke, I think that if that was the way that Jesus wanted to play this out, then I don't think Jesus would have approached him and said, here's my hands and here's my side. Why did Jesus prove it to him the way that he said, that Thomas said he would need it proved? And I don't think necessarily that Jesus was happy that Thomas doubted, but I don't think that Jesus just discounted him because he had doubts, right? He didn't. Jesus didn't discount him because he had doubts. And I think there's one thing we need to remember here as we think about this, as we think about doubts, as we think about all of this, is that Thomas's doubts weren't necessarily a rejection. And I think it's important for us to remember that the doubts usually aren't just an outright rejection. There's just doubts on that. And Thomas, after this interaction where Jesus is like, put your finger in my hand and see my side, Thomas says something profound after this. Thomas says, my Lord and my God. And this is one of the first proclamations that Jesus is personally his Lord. People within the gospel text, people called Jesus Lord, but it isn't until after the resurrection that people are calling Jesus my Lord. There's a personalness of this. But Thomas also declares, my God. And this is the first time anyone had called Jesus my God. This wonderful declaration to Jesus. And I think as we read through this scripture, two questions tend to come to mind as we read through this story. And that's what happens when we have doubts or we have questions. And the second question, which is much like that, is how do we treat others that may have doubts or questions? And I'm going to say having doubts or having questions isn't a bad thing. A lot of times having doubts is part of something that's happened in the past that makes us weary of the future. And maybe Thomas had been fooled before and he just wasn't going to let it happen again. And he was putting up some defenses again. And maybe that's why Jesus doesn't just outright rebuke him, because he understands that this isn't necessarily an unbelief, this is a doubt, because Thomas doesn't want to get wrapped up and thrown again at another in this situation. And I'm going to say something that maybe hasn't been said or you haven't heard, but Jesus can handle our doubts. And Jesus can handle our questions. Christianity isn't a place where we just have to come in and know all the answers and have no doubts and have no questions. Christianity isn't we as Christians don't just come in and we're certain. I mean, there's certain things that we are certain about, right? Like to come in, we have to be certain of some things, but there's still going to be some doubts and there's still going to be questions. And that doesn't necessarily mean that there's an unbelief. One of the places that we go to learn about our doubts and our questions is with other Christians. And there has to be an open honestness to that. I don't ever want this church to be a place where we can't have doubts and we can't ask questions, because that is the ultimate place where we need to be able to talk about that. There are so many people in this world that have been burned by what I'm going to just refer to as a false hope. And maybe you're one of them. Maybe you're one of them that has been burnt by a false hope before. So when someone tells you about something good, that's what's going to happen. You tend to respond with, I'll believe it when I see it, right? And maybe you're one who asks a lot of questions and trying to understand all aspects of this. Let's understand that not everything is black and white, but let's see where the edges of the gray are, right? Let's take this out and try to ask questions. If it happens this way, is it this way? If this happens this way. And we have to understand that sometimes within Christianity too, that there is gray and there aren't necessarily always completely defined answers for things. But the beautiful thing, what I feel is one of the most beautiful things about the gospel, is that it's big enough to handle that, right? It's big enough to handle our questions and to handle our doubts. And I believe that all that I've said is something we have to overlay on situations that we might have with others as well. Having doubts aren't bad. Having questions aren't bad. Maybe you know someone in your life who has been fooled by what we're going to call this false hope, right? Maybe you know someone that tends to have a pessimistic tone on life. They say it a lot. I'll believe it when I see it. And maybe they don't say it out loud all the time, but just from seeing their eyes, you know that they're thinking in their brain, I'll believe it when I see it. But understanding the gospel has room. It's large enough for people to have doubts. It's large enough to handle others' doubts. Remembering the doubts don't necessarily mean unbelief. The gospel is large enough to have questions asked of it. Yes, as we go farther and farther into our faith, it is a hope that the farther we go, the deeper we go into relationship, the more that we will step out in faith, not even asking those questions, right? Like there is hopefully going to come a point of time where we step out in faith and just don't ask a lot of questions of God. We just go because we know that that's where He wants us to go. But I assume that all of us are at different positions in our lives, and all of us have lived different lives, and all of us have been burnt in the past by something that has proved, that was promised to us that this is going to be an amazing thing for you, and it just turned out that it wasn't. I'm taking a large assumption that everybody sitting in this room has gone through that at some point in time in their life. And we have to take the assumption that the people that we are talking to about Jesus have all had that happen in their lives too. Something that sounds so big and too good to be true. I'll believe that when I see it. Thomas, who was with Jesus during his ministry. Thomas, who was with Jesus during his ministry, said, I will believe it when I see it and when I touch it. Jesus meets Thomas in those doubts, in that place of doubt. And Jesus shows Thomas that it's real. And I think that's part of the beauty of this passage and many others, that Jesus meets people in their doubt. Jesus meets people in their pain. Jesus meets people within the biblical text in some of the darkest parts of their life. And Jesus meets the broken, and He meets the hungry, and He meets those in need, and Jesus meets them right where they are. But Jesus doesn't leave them there, right? Jesus doesn't just let them stay in that brokenness. Jesus says, there's more to this. There's more to this. And He shows them, and He answers their questions, and He shows them what it's like and what the kingdom of heaven is like. And he meets them there and he brings them along. And I would argue that that's a design for our lives as well. When we try to be Christ-like, right? When we continue to pray, Lord, make me Christ-like. Not to say in our doubt, not to stay in our doubt, not to stay in the places where we're afraid, not to stay in those places of question, right? We don't stay in those places because Jesus has called us out of those places. And as if we're talking about us being Christ-like, then we meet people in those places as well, and we call them out of those places, and we say, come and see Jesus. When we become more and more like Christ, we help others that are in those places come to understand that this is real. This is not a false hope, that this is a real hope. And we don't do that. We don't do that by casting rebuke on them or by casting them out or not letting them ask questions or telling them if they ask questions, then that means they don't have faith. And if they doubt, then that means that they don't have faith and they need to just leave. We don't do it that way. We do that by meeting them where they are and answering the questions and showing them why this is real. Thomas later went on to spread the gospel in India. He was still used and still on mission for God, even though at that moment he had doubts, he had questions. Jesus coming to see him and showing him how this isn't just something that people are trying to sell him. This isn't just another false hope moment, that this is real and true. Thomas takes up the mission and goes, right? Jesus says, come and see and go out, right? Those are the motions that happens in this. If you have doubt, if you have questions, I pray that you will find someone who is safe to express that doubt to, that is safe to ask those questions to. Someone in your life that is reflecting Jesus and will meet you in that space and answers the questions that you may have, and to help you to understand that this isn't just a false hope where you're going to get burned. And if you have people who doubt around you or ask questions, I pray that you reflect Jesus and help people as they process their doubts and their questions, that you don't rebuke people for having doubts, for having questions, because Jesus didn't. I pray as a church that our words be seasoned and God guide our steps. We're going to close with one final song, and then I'll close us in prayer. We're going to sing Made for More, understanding that we were made for more and that others around us were made for more. And part of being Christ-like is helping others to understand that they were made for more and meeting them where they are. Let's sing Made for More.